Hello BookTube, and welcome to your Daily Penguin. That's our very slow day-by-day tour through my Penguin classics. We are in the ancient world. It's one of the only organizations that I have to my Penguin wall. And today we're dealing with one of the greatest authors of the ancient world. One of the foremost ones in my mind for the power of his prose, for the insight, for the readability, even for the wisdom. And that is the first century author Plutarch, who was given, he was a very popular author in his day. He was given broad public honors by the Roman Emperor Trajan and even more public honors by the Roman Emperor Hadrian, and spent his whole life writing two types of things. Basically, the first type of thing that he spent time writing were long and very historically literate moral essays. Closest thing that I could compare them to today would be Ralph Waldo Emerson. And the other thing that he spent his lifetime writing, by far the predominant thing that he spent his lifetime writing, was a master work of biography called The Parallel Lives, in which he took great figures from Greek history and great figures from Roman history. He himself was Greek, but had lived his whole life with Roman patronage in the Roman world, and compares them. It's a vast work. He worked on it his whole life and issued it piecemeal as, you know, for readings and for small publications of individual lives or individual parallel lives. But he would take a great figure from Greek history and a great figure from Roman history, write an individual biography of each one of them according to his own lights and the best sources that he could sift through, write a prologue to that comparison, and then write an epilogue in which he summarizes the compared biographies and draws out some of the threads. So it was possible, and it was done in his lifetime, to make each comparison a little book. They're kind of designed that way. But he was also working on the whole work, on the whole of the parallel lives, and in his later years worked on and revised the parallel lives into one book, showing not just parallel lives of individual men, but also parallels in history, thematic parallels that were very important to him. And that was the finished work. That was the masterpiece of his lifetime. And we're getting to it now in Penguin Classics, and I'm going to show you a bunch of books. And you would think, maybe at first, why would you do that? Why would you show me a bunch of books? Why would you do that, right? When we saw On the Nature of Things by Lucretius, which was also his life's work, worked on for his whole life, his recognized masterpiece in his own day and ever since. I didn't show you bunches of books, but when it comes to Plutarch, I have to show you bunches of books, and that annoys me. So the first one I want to show you is a mass market Penguin classic. This is Ian Scott Kilvert's translation of some Roman lives. This is the makers of Rome. So this is the beginning of Roman history. You have Coriolanus, Fabius Maximus, Cato the Elder, Marcellus, the brothers Gracchi, Sertorius, the rebellious general who had a pet fawn, Brutus, and Mark Antony. These are the makers of the marquee version of Rome. And this is a mass market paperback. I got it at an old bookstore called the Penguin Bookstore. There used to be a Penguin bookstore in Cambridge, right across the river from Boston. And it was a great place. It was all Penguin Classics. That's all they did. It was just a Penguin store. And I would shop there from time to time. But at the time, I worked in a bookstore right up the street and got an employee discount. So there wasn't anything that the Penguin store had that I couldn't get in my own store. And then the Penguin store was actually run by the brother of the man who ran the store where I was working. And times being what they are and the rents being what they are, eventually the Penguin store had to close. And they had an incredibly Byzantine going out of business sale where things were marked down according to Zoroastrian calendars. I don't even know how it was done. Every single, I of course volunteered to help out and to harvest. And all of us who went there to help out with that sale were presented with these vast Newtonian calculuses of how to figure out what things were discounted. And it ended up not mattering, of course. Going out of business sales, it ends up not mattering. in the last couple of days, we were all just shoving stuff into sacks and taking it home. And this was one of the books that I got from that store. And it's one of the 4 books that Penguin Classic used to make. They used to make The Makers of Rome, The Fall of Rome, the Makers of Athens, and The Age of Alexander. And you can sort of see from that idea that they split up the major Roman lives into 2 volumes and the major Greek lives into 2 volumes. And they grouped the Greek lives that had anything to do with Alexander the Great around him. Because Plutarch's life of Alexander the Great is fantastic. Just the point that I want to make, Ian Scott Kilvert does a fantastic job as the translator. Naturally, when it comes to Plutarch translators, my foremost loyalty is to John Dryden and to the stable of uncredited workaday hack translators who helped to make the gigantic Plutarch's Lives that Dryden put his name on, and that was a bestseller in his day and has been a bestseller ever since. Almost certainly, when you see a basic reprint line like Modern Library, for instance, you will see the Modern Library 1-volume Plutarch's Lives all the time. Or I think it was Everyman Library. Whenever you see a collected Plutarch, it will be some variation of the Dryden, usually. But Ian Scott Kilvert is really good. I don't mean any disrespect to Dryden. Dryden, of course, has period language, and translations are hard enough as it is. So he does a really good, clear, companionable job. He does an excellent job at conveying the foremost thing about Plutarch, which is going to seem a little unlikely to anybody who hasn't actually tried the classics of ancient Greece and Rome, no matter what I do to try to make these things less intimidating. Plenty of people think that they're not going to be enjoyable. And Ian Scott Kilvert does a great job of conveying one of the contradictions to that, which is Plutarch's immense readability. He's immensely readable. Believe you me, you had to be immensely readable if you were going to get the Roman Emperor Trajan to read your book. Let's just put it that way. Let's be gentle and put it that way. And Plutarch is. He has the effortless, clear readability and sense that comes from an author who is living his work and who was born to write it. And the reason that I'm showing you this one little mass market paperback, and I could show you others. Here's a Penguin trade paperback called The Rise of Rome. Now this has all of the lives that I just mentioned, and also fabulous lives, fable lives like Romulus or Numa or Publicola. It has Coriolanus, it has Camillus, but it does not have Brutus and Mark Antony. They are moved into another big volume that Penguin does called Rome in Crisis, that has the Julius Caesar and the Brutus and the Antony and all of the other stuff. So that nowadays, Penguin Classics Plutarch Parallel Lives has 2 big Roman volumes and 1 big Greek volume in which a lot of the lives have been shepherded, sort of blurred together, and added to the Age of Alexander. And so you have the old mass market paperback, The Makers of Rome, and then, of course, Penguin did a trade paperback of this, and then they did The Fall of the Roman Republic. This is a little textbook example of how to do and how not to do the cover of a classic reprint. This is, of course, a Renaissance fresco. What it is that Penguin editors have with frescoes, I have no idea, except maybe that their reprints are free. This is a much better cover. Much more evocative. And all should look like this. The Fall of the Roman Republic, this is an older version. Ian Scott Kilvert took over the Plutarch volumes from Rex Warner, who was a great woolly old classicist from the early part of the 20th century, and who did all of Plutarch for Penguin first. And his translations are much more Dryden-esque than Ian Scott Kilvert. They're a little stiffer. And this has, let me see here, Marius, Sulla, Crassus, Pompey, Caesar, and Cicero. So that is the Fall of the Roman Republic. And Penguin also does a volume of these. The Rome in Crisis has all of these lives, only translated by Ian Scott Kilvert. And Penguin also does a volume of the other stuff, a slim volume, a selection of the other stuff that Plutarch wrote, the moralistic historical essays. This one is their volume Plutarch on Sparta, because he wrote a great deal about Sparta, including, I don't remember off the top of my head if this is by Richard Talbot. This is translated by Richard Talbot. I can't remember if this has the he wrote a stinging essay about Herodotus that it doesn't appear to be in here. Yeah, it doesn't appear to be in here, but that's okay. Or actually not. It's not okay. And I wanted to show you. These are the Penguin Classic Plutarchs that I happen to have, just matched and mismatched over time on my shelves. And I want to read you why that is necessary. I'm reading here from The Rise of Rome. This is the new volume of Plutarch. And this is translated by Ian Scott Kilbert, and we get a series preface by Christopher Pelling. And it's from Christopher Pelling that I want to read you a bit before I animate just a bit. Because he starts his preface to the Penguin Plutarch by explaining why it looks the way it does. Let's see here. There has also been given an opportunity to do... He's talking about updating from the Rex Warner to the Ian Scott Kilbert. This is also given an opportunity to divide up the lives in a different way, although it is not straightforward to decide what different way that would be. Nearly all Plutarch's surviving biographies were written in pairs as parallel lives. Thus, a book for Plutarch was not just Theseus or Caesar, but Theseus and Romulus, or Alexander and Caesar, plus the preface, plus the epilogue. Most, but not all, of those pairs have a brief epilogue at the end of the second life, comparing the two heroes, just as many have a prologue before the first life, giving some initial grounds for the comparison. Not much attention was paid to this comparative technique at the time when the Penguin series started to appear, and it seemed natural then to separate each life from its pair and organize the volumes by period and city, Rome or Athens. The comparative epilogues were not included in the translations at all. That now looks very unsatisfactory. The comparative technique has come to be seen as basic to Plutarch's strategy, underlying not only those brief epilogues, but also the entire pairings. It is true, although, that in the last few years, scholars have become increasingly alert to the way that all the lives, not just the pairs, are crafted to complement each other. In other words, in the late 20th century, Plutarch scholars started to wonder if maybe Plutarch didn't know what the flip he was doing. It looks like these things were paired for a reason. It is very tempting to keep the pairings in this new series in a way that would respect Plutarch's own authorial intentions. Well, yes, that would be very tempting, wouldn't it? You would think that temptation would be so self-evident that you would not even mention it. You would just obey it. But no. After some agonizing, we have decided nevertheless to keep to something like the original strategy of the series, though with some refinement. The reason is a practical one. Many, perhaps most, readers of Plutarch will be reading him to see what he has to say about a particular period, and will wish to compare his treatment of the major players to see how the different parts of his historical jigsaw fit together. If one kept the pairings, that would inevitably mean buying several different volumes of the series, and if, say, one organized those volumes by the Greek partner, so that, for instance, Pericles Fabius and Nicias Crassus and Coriolanus Alcibiades made one volume, anyone primarily interested in the Roman lives or the late Republic would probably need to buy the whole set. That is no way to guarantee these finely crafted works of art the wide reading that they deserve. The ironies here are so thick, I'm finding it impossible to read this with a straight face. Keeping the organization by period also allows some other works of Plutarch to be included along with the lives themselves. For instance, the fascinating essay on the malice of Herodotus, along with the lives of Themistocles and Aristides, and, as before, several Spartan essays along the Spartan lives. Of course, the comparative epilogues must now be included, and they will now be translated and printed along with the second life of each pair, just as the prologues are conventionally printed before the first life. Each volume will now also include more extended introductions to each life, which will draw attention to the importance of the comparison, as well as other features of Plutarch's technique. This is a compromise, and an uncomfortable one, but it still seemed the better way. That is not true. It may have seemed like an uncomfortable but workable compromise, but it is not the better way, because as Pelling makes perfectly clear, even in his own preface, that is not anything like what Plutarch intended. And it's not how he wrote his finished work. It may have been how he wrote the bits and pieces for individual sale and individual readings and individual publicity while he was working on the whole. But when he was done, he carefully crafted the whole as a work. For an editor, a series editor from Penguin Classic or anybody else to say, well, if we were to include all the Greek lives right alongside the Roman lives, readers would have to jump all around. They'd have to buy a lot more than they want. What if they want to concentrate on the late Republic? Is the same thing as if an editor of a Penguin Classic edition of Pride and Prejudice hacked it to pieces and said, well, what about all the readers who just come here for the Elizabeth and Darcy bits? We don't want to give them everything, right? Imagine how long the book would be if we gave them everything. No, this is an uncomfortable compromise, but it seemed best to hack up the book and just give them the Elizabeth and Darcy bits. We do not treat any other work of the classical world this way. This is a travesty. And it continues. It's almost invariable when it comes to editions of Plutarch's Parallel Lives. The Modern Library reprints the Dryden edition. Now, the Modern Library right now in the 21st century has a paperback reprint of the Dryden Plutarch that is in 2 volumes. Presumably under the assumption that a reader won't read it if it's all in 1 volume. It's not a prohibitively long volume. Printing the Ian Scott Kilvert, for instance, Parallel Lives in its entirety for Penguin Classics, plus all of the editorial and annotated information, would make a book no bigger than the Penguin Classic War and Peace, the Penguin Classic Tale of Genji. It would make a book no bigger than that, and that is the book that Plutarch wrote. That's the book that he intended you to read. So why no one has done that, aside from people dutifully reprinting the Dryden, I do not know. I have no idea. I don't know why there isn't, in English, several huge 1-volume Parallel Lives with tons of annotations. I don't know why when I get to Plutarch in your Daily Penguin I have to do this. And I could do more. I mean, there are a couple of extant Penguin Classic volumes of Plutarch that I don't have. It's annoying. And I wish this is a rare instance where I'm not blaming Penguin Classic, of course, because although they started it with the 4 volumes that they did for Rex Warner, they're by no means the only one who treat Plutarch this way. Acting as if an unabridged, unhacked up Parallel Lives would somehow be unbelievably unwieldy, just too big to print, when their own printing catalog shows that not true. Over my shoulder you can see books that are even longer than the complete Parallel Lives would be. So why we're jumping around like this, when I can tell you from personal experience, if you read Plutarch, just Plutarch, no translation, if you read Plutarch's Lives, Parallel Lives, as we have it, as he organized it, you very much see that those editors mentioned in that preface might be onto something, that it might be that he wrote so that there will be all sorts of echoes and parallels running throughout the whole work that are completely lost if you cut it up, if you carve it up. And they are completely lost in these. So I can strongly recommend that you read Plutarch. I do, in fact, strongly recommend that you read Plutarch. Ian Scott Kilvert is a fantastic Plutarch translator. If you move over to the Oxford World Classics, you will find, I think it's Robin Waterfield, does the exact same thing. Oxford does the exact same thing. They carve it up into Roman lives, Greek lives, Empire lives, Alexandrian lives, whatever it is. They carve up a work that isn't meant to be that way under the flimsiest of excuses. Usually 2. 1, that printing the whole thing just as it is would be way too long, when that is absolutely not true. Oxford World Classics does an unabridged Boswell's Life of Johnson, so does Penguin. That is the same length as Plutarch's Parallel Lives. And the other justification is the one that we heard. An absolutely absurd justification that, well, what about the readers who only want the Roman lives? So, that is your Daily Penguin for today is the Penguin Plutarch with a side of bile. Because I wish that Classics reprint houses didn't do this. Plutarch deserves better. Parallel Lives is an overwhelmingly brilliant book. And you'd be hard-pressed to know that if you wanted to read it now in 2020. Your options would be to either read it in Frankenstein slabs like these Penguins or Oxfords do, or in the John Dryden translation, which is very good, but it's also very much a piece of its day. I mean, it doesn't... We've talked about the ethos of translation here, and John Dryden himself would have been the foremost person to be horrified at anyone in 2020. He didn't believe the world would be around in 2020. Most of the people in his day believed the world would end in 2000. And don't we wish it had? But anyway, Dryden would have been the first person to be horrified at the idea that in 2020 people would still be reading a translation that was written 400 years beforehand. His whole ethos of translation, which we have talked about in this Daily Penguin, and we will continue to talk about translation, of course, in this series, is that it's supposed to be evergreen. It's supposed to speak to the language of the day. And although the Dryden translation is fantastic, it doesn't speak to the language of 2020. Obviously, it doesn't. And those are your choices. Today, if you want to read Plutarch and you don't have the Greek, you have to read him either hacked into bits and pieces in ways that he absolutely did not intend, or you have to read these and thous and whereupons. You have to read a John Locke treatise. So, given the choice, of course, I would recommend that you try one of these Penguin Frankenstein things or an Oxford Frankenstein thing. But now you know my 2 cents worth on the subject. So I'm going to wrap this up. But I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.